welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today I'm going to be talking about executive dysfunction, and we'll start off with a short story. So about a month or so ago, I needed to get new shoes because my shoes were falling apart. I'm really hard on footwear, so I need to go get new shoes. But I was procrastinating on this because I hate shoe shopping and I didn't want to do it. And my shoes weren't technically unwearable, so I just kept putting it off. But eventually I finally work up to it. I enter the shoe store, I look, I see all the shoes, and immediately I just get overwhelmed and I leave. And then eventually I did go and get the shoes, but I had to take a list of steps with me to go through and look at them, even though these are all things that I know to do when I'm shoe shopping, you know. Stuff like look for shoes in your size, made out of the right materials because I'm vegan and I don't use animal products, stuff like that. And it was helpful, and I managed to get through it and get new shoes, and they're fine. So that experience of walking into the store, looking at the racks of shoes, being completely overwhelmed, and then having my brain basically shut down and say, no, we're not doing this today, is related to executive function. Executive function is what the frontal lobe of your brain does. It probably does other things too, I'm not a brain scientist, but executive dysfunction is related to the frontal lobe of your brain. Executive functioning is your ability to do things like plan out the steps to a task, start doing a task, switch tasks, stay focused on a task, control impulses, that sort of thing. There's a lot of areas related to executive function. And executive dysfunction, as you might guess, is basically the absence of the ability to do one of those things, or the impairment of that ability. Executive dysfunction is associated not just with autism, but also with ADHD and anxiety and depression, some types of brain injury, and probably a lot of other things that I'm not listing here. So it's a pretty common trait for a lot of different neurodivergencies. So I think it's important to talk about for that reason. Basically, executive dysfunction can look like a lot of different things. What I talked about at the beginning of the video is an example of difficulty with putting the steps together because I was overwhelmed because I hate shoe shopping and I don't do it very much. So it was both an unfamiliar experience and one that I just don't like. So that combined to reduce my ability to do executive functioning. And I had a hard time putting the steps together in my head to figure out how to break the task of get new shoes into all of those smaller tasks, like look for shoes in your size, try them on, that sort of thing. So breaking things down into steps is part of executive functioning, and a common type of executive dysfunction is looking at a task and feeling like it's just this one solid brick of a task that you can't break down into the smaller, more manageable steps. And of course, it helps to break things down into a list and take that with you if you know that you're going to have this type of issue. Other types of executive functioning can involve difficulties with rigidity of thinking, which is an autistic trait anyways, so that can actually be related to executive dysfunction, is having difficulties with mental flexibility, and the rules changing, that sort of thing. There can also be difficulties with task switching, starting or stopping a task, switching between tasks, and that's how you end up, just refreshing Tumblr over and over, and there's no new posts, but it's just easier to keep refreshing it than to switch to do something else. You're not really enjoying what you're doing because there's nothing more to look at, but you just can't get over that mental barrier to do something else instead. That's another example of that type of executive dysfunction. And I like to think of that sort of executive dysfunction issue as like in a chemical reaction when you have, your reactants that combine to form your products, and they both have specific levels of energy. And then in order to get from one to the other, you need to go over the activation energy hump, which is just this level of energy that's required to start the reaction. And I think executive functioning can be sort of like that. You need that bit of energy, that executive functioning, to get you across that energy that's required to complete the reaction or the process of switching from one thing to another thing. So that's why, at least for me, I find my executive functioning is a lot worse when I'm tired, when I've just had a meltdown, when I'm worn out at the end of the day, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other people also find that their executive functioning is better when they have more energy and worse when they have less energy, because it does take energy. But that's not the only type of executive functioning, even though I think those two are the most commonly discussed. Trying to get yourself to do a task and not being able to, or trying to do a task but unable to break it down into steps. I think those are the two most commonly talked about types of executive functioning that I see. But there is more to it than that, and I'd like to also talk about some of the less commonly discussed types of executive functioning. Executive functioning is also related to emotional control and impulse control and your ability to manage what you're doing. And I don't see people talk about that too much. So executive functioning can also be a difficulty with controlling negative emotions, a difficulty with, preventing yourself from getting distracted and staying focused. I wouldn't be surprised if that might be more common in ADHD, but I don't have ADHD, so I don't know. If you do, you can let me know in the comments if that's the type of executive functioning that's often associated with ADHD. But in general, that sort of executive dysfunction isn't something I see people talk about a lot, and it is part of executive functioning, is your ability to manage your own emotions and your own reactions to things and to stay calm and cool and collected and whatnot. So I do want to mention that, because it's not just about your ability to complete a task, it's also about your ability to stay focused and calm while doing the task and to manage frustrations. And I think we often talk about your ability to manage frustrations and things as though that's a moral thing. You're a bad person if you can't stay calm during this task. And that's not necessarily true. It's just how your frontal lobe is capable of managing or not managing the situation. And that's true for executive functioning in general. I think people tend to moralize the concept of being able to do something, and that's why a lot of people with executive dysfunction have had a lot of issues with being called or considered lazy, told they're just not trying hard enough, or that they really just don't want to do the task, when in reality it's that the task is literally harder for them to complete because of this issue with the way their brain works. And I also want to challenge the concept of laziness in general here, really, because people talk about laziness a lot, and I don't think it's really as useful a concept as people might think of it to be. Laziness is something people talk about in so many different contexts that I feel like it's almost become meaningless. People might say, oh, this person is lazy because they just don't want to do this, they're not trying hard enough to do this thing that I think they should do, and that's something that tends to affect people with executive dysfunction. Or they might say, oh, I'm just feeling lazy today, I don't want to do this, I'm just going to relax. And I feel like those are two very different uses of the word. In one use, you're saying that you or someone else is lazy for not doing something that they should do. And in the other context, you're saying that you feel lazy because you feel like you're low on energy and you just want to relax instead of doing the thing. And, a lot of the time when someone is considered lazy, I think there's a more legitimate reason behind it, and just using the word laziness is almost a way of dismissing that and dismissing anything else that might be going on. Laziness isn't a very useful concept to me. A lot of the time, someone who might be considered lazy is having issues with executive functioning, or maybe they're depressed, or maybe that thing just isn't as high priority for them as it is for you. And by saying that the person is lazy, what you're really saying is that their priorities are different from yours, and you're judging them for that. Or you're judging yourself for having priorities that are different than what you feel they should be. And I feel like all of those things have different reasons and different ways of resolving the issue, that just using the word lazy isn't really helping, and that's just my 2 cents on that. So ways of dealing with executive dysfunction are incredibly varied because of the variety in ways that executive dysfunction can manifest. There's lots of apps out there that, can have timers and reminders if those help you. For me, I find having a deadline and some reason that it has to be done will often help get over that energy barrier in my brain. I'm not sure why, but it does help me sometimes. That's why I can usually get things done if there's an actual deadline associated with them, but I might take a little longer to do it if there's no specific time it has to be done. And other things like having someone to walk you through the steps can be helpful. Really, it all depends on you and your experiences and what you find helps or doesn't help you, which is why it can be very frustrating to deal with, because there's nothing that's guaranteed to help. but there's lots of things to try, and it's an issue that a lot of other people also have, so you're not alone. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out some of the other videos on my channel, and I hope you have a great day.